I did not argue, cry, or apologize. I simply looked at my father and said, "Okay then." The next morning, my sister's victory lap ended abruptly at my empty desk. 5 minutes later, the company lawyer burst in, begging to know if I had sent the attachment to everyone. My father's smirk vanished the second he opened his inbox. He had no idea I had been planning my exit for years, and that email was just the final step. My name is Juliet Collins, and for the last 7 years, I have been the invisible steel skeleton holding up the crumbling facade of Blackridge Compliance Technologies. I was 34 years old, the director of product and engineering, and I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove that competence matters more than charisma. I was wrong. I realized just how wrong I was on a Tuesday morning in late October. Standing at the head of a mahogany table that cost more than my first car, while the people supposed to be leading this company watched a family tragedy play out like a corporate soap opera, the air inside the boardroom was recycled and freezing, a stark contrast to the humidity lingering outside in Charlotte. The glass walls of the conference room, which we pretentiously called the aquarium, offered no privacy. Everyone on the floor could see us, but thanks to the soundproofing, they could not hear the career suicide happening in real time. I was in the middle of presenting the critical path for Project Willow. This was not just another software update. This was the flagship compliance architecture that was supposed to save our third quarter and secure our renewal with the massive healthcare conglomerate that made up 40% of our revenue. I had the schematics up on the 80-inch monitor. I had the JIRA tickets organized by velocity. I had the truth. Project Willow is currently in the red zone regarding the encryption layer, I said, keeping my voice level. My laser pointer hovered over the timeline. We are looking at a code freeze by November 15th. That gives us 6 weeks for penetration testing and security audits. If we rush this, we violate HIPAA compliance standards in 3 different states. We need 12 weeks to go live safely. 12? Not a day less. I saw heads nodding around the table. Marianne Holt, one of the few independent board members who actually read the briefing packets, was taking notes. Ethan Rowe, our general counsel, looked relieved that I was being realistic about the legal risks. For a moment, sanity was prevailing, then the door swung open. It did not just open, it was thrown wide as if an actor were making an entrance on Broadway. My sister, Blair, walked in. Blair was 2 years older than me, the vice president of sales, and she possessed a terrifying inability to understand the word no. She was dressed in a crimson power suit that screamed for attention, a stark contrast to my charcoal gray blazer. She did not apologize for being 20 minutes late. She never did. "Stop the panic train. Juliet," Blair announced, her voice pitching up into that sugary, breathless tone she used to charm clients and manipulate our father. "You are boring everyone with the technical gloom and doom. I have amazing news." She dropped a leather folio onto the table with a heavy thud. "I just got off the phone with the client." She beamed, looking directly at our father at the head of the table, ignoring me entirely. I closed the upsell. They signed the amendment for the full enterprise package. A murmur of approval went around the table. Revenue was revenue, after all. Gordon Collins, our CEO and my father, leaned back in his leather chair, a proud smile stretching across his face. "That is my girl," he said. "That is exactly the kind of aggression we need right now." "Good work." "Blair, there is a condition," Blair added, waving her hand dismissively as if she were swatting away a fly. "They need the rollout completed before their fiscal year ends. I promised them we would deploy in 4 weeks. The room went silent. The oxygen seemed to be sucked out of the ventilation system. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at the timeline on the screen behind me, then back at my sister. "Blair," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "That is impossible. Don't be such a naysayer," she snapped, finally looking at me. Her eyes were hard, devoid of any sisterly warmth. "You always do this. You complicate things to make yourself look smart." "It is not about looking smart," I said, keeping my tone steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. It is about math. We have terabytes of sensitive patient data to migrate. The encryption keys alone take 2 weeks to generate and verify. If we deploy in 4 weeks, we skip the security audit. If we skip the audit, we are liable for any breach. We are talking about millions of dollars in fines, not to mention jail time for negligence. Gordon cleared his throat. It was a deep, rumbling sound that usually signaled the end of a discussion. "Juliet, you are exaggerating," Gordon said. "You engineers always pad the estimates. You want 12 weeks so you can coast. I am sure if the team pulls a few all-nighters, 4 weeks is plenty." I turned to face him. He looked so much like the portrait of himself hanging in the lobby, but the eyes were different. In the painting, he looked visionary. In person, he looked tired and stubborn. A man who had inherited a company and was terrified of letting anyone see he did not understand how it worked. "Dad, this isn't padding," I said, using the familial term which I usually avoided in meetings. But I was desperate. "I sent you the risk assessment email 3 days ago. I explicitly stated that any timeline under 10 weeks creates a critical failure risk. We cannot physically write the code that fast. It does not exist." Gordon's face darkened. He hated being contradicted, especially in front of the board, and doubly so when it involved Blair. He viewed Blair as the extension of his own charisma, while he viewed me as a glorified mechanic who kept trying to tell him his Ferrari couldn't fly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I recognized the letterhead. It was a printout of an email I had sent to the client's technical lead the previous afternoon, clarifying the technical roadmap after Blair had given them vague, inaccurate information during a lunch meeting. "I have this," Gordon said, shaking the paper in the air. "The client forwarded this to Blair. You went behind her back. You told them the sales timeline was, and I quote, optimistic and unrealistic. I was doing damage control. I argued. Gripping the edge of the table, Blair promised them features we haven't even scoped yet. I had to manage their expectations before we signed a contract we couldn't fulfill. That is my job as director of product, to ensure we can deliver what we sell." "Your job," Gordon roared, slamming his hand down on the table, "is to support this family. Your job is to make your sister look good, not to cut her down at the knees because you are jealous of her success." The word jealous hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I looked around the room. Ethan Rowe was studying his cufflinks. Marianne Holt was staring at Gordon with a mixture of shock and disdain, but she stayed silent. The other board members, mostly Gordon's golf buddies, looked at the floor. This was a public execution, and nobody wanted to get splattered. "I am not jealous," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "I am competent. There is a difference." Gordon stood up. He was a large man, and he used his size to intimidate. He walked over to where I was standing. He stood close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and the stale coffee on his breath. "You are suspended," he stated. The word did not register at first. It was too absurd. I was running the most critical division in the company. "Excuse me," I asked. 2 weeks, Gordon declared, loud enough for the secretaries outside the glass to hear. "Unpaid. You need a timeout to think about your attitude. You do not come back until you are ready to apologize to Blair in front of this entire team and learn to respect the chain of command. You need to learn to respect your sister's authority." Blair was smiling. It was a small, tight smile, the kind she used to wear when we were children, and she had successfully blamed me for a broken vase. She sat back, crossing her legs, looking every bit the victor. I looked at the whiteboard behind me, covered in the intricate architecture of the software that I had built from the ground up. I looked at the faces of the men and women who were letting this happen. I looked at my father, who was red in the face, waiting for me to break. He wanted tears. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to say, "I am sorry. Daddy, I will do better." He wanted the submission he felt he was owed. For 100 years, or perhaps just 10 seconds. The room was absolutely silent. The hum of the projector fan was the only sound. I felt something inside me snap. It was not a violent break. It was quiet, like a dry twig stepping on a forest floor. It was the severing of the last thread of obligation I felt toward these people, the fear of losing my job, the desperate need for his approval, the anxiety about the project. It all evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I did not argue. I did not explain the labor laws he was violating. I did not point out that suspending the lead engineer 2 weeks before a major deadline was corporate suicide. I looked Gordon Collins in the eye and said 2 words. Okay then. The rhythm of the room faltered. They were braced for a fight. They were ready for the drama. My acceptance was a void they did not know how to fill. Gordon blinked, confused. He opened his mouth to say something else, perhaps to pile on another condition, but I was already moving. I turned to the table. I unplugged the HDMI cable from my laptop with a sharp click. The screen behind me went black, plunging the room into partial shadow. I closed my laptop lid. I gathered my leather notebook and my pen. Blair's smile faltered. She had expected a tantrum. She fed on emotional turmoil. My silence was starving her. "Juliet," she said, her voice uncertain. "We aren't finished." I did not look at her. I did not look at any of them. I tucked my laptop under my arm. I pushed my chair back in, ensuring it was perfectly aligned with the table. I walked toward the glass doors. My heels clicked against the polished floor, a steady, rhythmic metronome counting down the seconds of my employment. "You walk out that door, Juliet, and you don't come back until you fix this," Gordon shouted after me, his voice cracking slightly. He sounded less like a CEO and more like a man realizing he had just thrown his car keys into a river. I kept walking. I reached the door, grabbed the cold metal handle, and pulled. As I stepped out of the pressurized atmosphere of the boardroom and into the open hallway, I did not slam the door. I let the heavy glass pane slide shut on its hydraulic hinge. It clicked into place with a sound that was final and absolute. It sounded like the closing of a vault. It sounded like the end of an era. I walked toward the elevator, leaving the sharks in the tank, unaware that I had just drained the water. The walk from the boardroom to my office was less than 50 yards, but it felt like crossing a border between 2 warring nations. I moved through the open-plan workspace of the engineering floor, a space I had designed myself 2 years ago to maximize collaboration and natural light. Usually, this area was a hive of quiet, focused energy, the click-clack of mechanical keyboards creating a rhythm I found soothing. Today, the silence was heavy and suffocating. Heads ducked as I passed. I could feel the weight of their eyes on my back, the side glances, the frantic instant messages being typed the second I was out of earshot. They knew. In a company like Blackridge, bad news traveled faster than light. The glass walls of the boardroom had broadcast my execution to the entire floor, and even if they had not heard the words, the body language was a universal language of dismissal. I reached my office at the far end of the hall and closed the door. I did not slam it. I simply shut out the noise. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still resting on the cool metal of the doorknob, breathing in the scent of dry erase markers and faint ozone. This room had been my sanctuary. I looked at the walls. To my left was the 6-month roadmap for Project Willow, a sprawling, color-coded timeline that I had agonized over for weeks. I had fought for every milestone on that board. I had negotiated every sprint, balanced every resource, and calculated every risk. Now, looking at the red and green markers, the sticky notes, and the architectural diagrams, I felt a sudden, jarring sense of dissociation. It was like looking at a stranger's house. Those were not my deadlines anymore. That was not my code to protect. The complex web of logic and structure I had built to keep this company safe was no longer my shield. It was just ink on a whiteboard. I walked over to my desk and sat down, not in the ergonomic chair I had fought to get for everyone in the department, but on the edge of the desk itself. My phone, which I had placed face down, began to vibrate. It buzzed against the wood, a relentless, angry sound. I turned it over. The notifications were cascading down the screen like a waterfall. "Is it true? Did Gordon actually suspend you? We cannot ship the beta without your sign-off. Juliet, please tell me this is a joke. The messages were from the junior developers, the QA leads, the project managers, the people who actually did the work while Blair was out drinking cocktails with clients. They were panicked. They were the ones who would have to work 80-hour weeks to try and meet the impossible deadline Blair had just sold. They were the ones who would get blamed when the system inevitably crashed or leaked data. I watched the names scroll by, feeling a pang of guilt. I had always been their umbrella. I stood between them and the chaotic, irrational demands of the executive suite. I absorbed the acid rain so they could write clean code. Now, I had been folded up and put away. I did not reply to the group chat. I did not send a mass email reassuring them. That would be insubordination. And I was currently playing a very specific game, even if I had not fully admitted it to myself yet. I opened my secure messaging app and found one name, Miles Carter. Miles was my lead architect. He was brilliant, anxious, and the only person in the building who knew the system as well as I did. He was currently typing, the 3 little dots dancing on the screen. I typed first, "You are in the driver's seat." Miles, do not promise anything you cannot deliver physically. If they ask for magic, show them the math. I hit send. Then I turned off the notifications for the work app. I looked around the room again, this time with the eyes of a scavenger. Gordon had said 2 weeks. He expected me to go home, stew in my misery, realize that I was nothing without the family name, and come back crawling on my knees to apologize to Blair. He expected a chastised daughter. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a collapsed cardboard box I had kept from a shipment of books. I popped it open and began to fill it. I did not pack for a 2-week vacation. I took the framed photo of my graduation from MIT. I took the small, ugly ceramic cactus that the intern team had bought me last Christmas. I took my stash of premium tea bags and my noise-canceling headphones. I took the stress ball shaped like a grenade. I did not touch the company laptop. I did not touch the hard drives. I did not touch a single piece of paper that belonged to Blackridge. I was stripping the room of me, leaving behind only the hollow shell of the job title. As I reached for a framed photograph on the bookshelf, my hand paused. It was a picture of me and Blair from 20 years ago. We were teenagers. I was holding a science fair trophy. Looking awkward and stiff in an oversized polo shirt, Blair was hugging me, smiling dazzlingly at the camera, wearing a dress that cost more than my entire science project. The memory washed over me, cold and sharp. I remembered that day. I had spent 3 months building a robotic arm that could sort recyclables. I had burned my fingers with soldering irons, stayed up until 3 in the morning debugging the sensors, and missed the school dance to finish the code. I won first place in the state. When we got home, Gordon had clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good job, Jules." Expected nothing less. Then, 10 minutes later, Blair had come into the living room crying because a boy had not asked her to the dance. The entire household had ground to a halt. Gordon had spent 2 hours comforting her, ordering pizza, and promising to buy her a car to make her feel better. My trophy sat on the kitchen counter, next to the mail, ignored until it was eventually shoved into a closet. It had always been the binary code of our family. Juliet is the machine. She runs. She works. She does not need maintenance. Blair is the art. She is fragile. She is beautiful. She must be protected and admired. I was the support beam. Blair was the chandelier. Nobody thanks the beam for holding up the roof, but everyone gasps when the chandelier lights up. My phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. It was not a work number. The caller ID flashed Aunt Renee. I stared at the screen. Renee was my mother's younger sister. She was the black sheep of the family because she had refused to work for the company, choosing instead to open a bakery in Savannah. She was sharp-tongued, observant, and the only person in the family who refused to treat Gordon like a demigod. I picked up. "Hey, Aunt Renee." I did not even have to say what happened. He called me. "Juliet," she said without preamble. Her voice was tight with suppressed anger. "Your father just got off the phone with me. He was ranting for 20 minutes. He wants me to, and I'm quoting him here. Talk some sense into the girl and remind her where her loyalty lies." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "He works fast. He is a fool, Renee snapped. I told him that. I told him that suspending the only person in that building who knows the difference between a server and a toaster is the stupidest business decision he has made since he bought that yacht. He thinks he is teaching me a lesson, I said, placing the picture of me and Blair face down in the trash bin. I did not pack it. He is terrified, Renee said. Her voice dropped, becoming serious. Listen to me. Juliet, he is terrified because you stood up to him. He does not know how to handle women who do not need him. He broke your mother the same way. I stopped moving. My mother had died 5 years ago from a sudden aneurysm, or so the death certificate said. In reality, she had died of stress. She had spent 30 years managing Gordon's ego, cleaning up his messes, and mediating the wars between him and the board. What do you mean? I asked. There is something you do not know, Renee said. I promised your mother I would not give this to you unless things got bad, unless Gordon tried to push you out or break your spirit. I think today qualifies. My grip tightened on the phone. What is it? Your mother kept files. Juliet. She knew who Gordon was. She knew who Blair was turning into. She loved them. But she was not blind. She left a box with me. It is a ledger. A ledger, not of money, Renee clarified. Of facts. Every time Gordon overruled a safety protocol, every time he lied to a client and made the staff cover it up, every time he favored Blair to the detriment of the business, she wrote it all down. She called it her insurance policy for you. She said, one day, Juliet is going to wake up and realize she is being gaslighted. When that day comes, give her the proof. I stood frozen in the middle of my half-packed office. The air conditioning hummed above me, but I felt a strange heat rising in my chest. For years, I had doubted myself. When Gordon told me I was being too critical, I believed him. When Blair told me I was socially inept and needed her to handle the people side, I believed her. When they told me I was ungrateful for wanting credit for my own work, I internalized it. I thought I was the problem. I thought I was just difficult, rigid, unlovable. You have the files? I asked, my voice steady. I am overnighting them to your apartment, Renee said. They will be there by 10 in the morning. Read them, Juliet, and then decide if you really want to apologize. I hung up the phone. I looked around the office one last time. The box was full. My desk was bare. The room looked generic, like it was waiting for the next cog to be slotted into the machine. But I was not a cog anymore. I was not imagining the bias. I was not crazy for thinking the timeline was impossible. I was not wrong for thinking that my sister was a liability and my father was a bully. The truth had been written down by the one person who saw it all, and it was coming to me in the mail. I picked up the box. It was heavy, but it felt lighter than the burden I had been carrying for a decade. I walked to the door and turned off the lights. The roadmap on the wall disappeared into the gloom. Project Willow was their problem now. I walked out of the office, past the rows of terrified developers, past the glass walls of the boardroom where the sharks were still circling, and I did not look back. I had entered the building that morning as an employee. I was leaving as a woman who had just been handed the ammunition for a war she had not even known she was fighting. The silence in my apartment was different from the silence in the boardroom. In the boardroom, the silence was heavy with judgment and impending violence. Here, surrounded by the beige walls of my living room and the faint hum of my refrigerator, the silence was clinical. It was the quiet of a surgeon scrubbing in before an operation. I sat at my dining table, which was currently covered in the contents of my life, or at least, the paper trail of my life. I had not opened the bottle of wine sitting on the counter. I needed my mind sharp. I needed to be the cold, unfeeling machine my father always accused me of being. I reached for a thick bound document that had been gathering dust in my filing cabinet for 3 years. It was my executive employment agreement. Most people do not read their contracts. They look at the salary figure, the stock options, and the vacation days, and they sign on the dotted line. I was not most people. I was an engineer. I read the documentation. I flipped to page 22, section 14, paragraph C. 3 years ago. Blackridge had undergone a legal restructuring. We were preparing for a potential IPO that never happened, and we had brought in expensive consultants to modernize our corporate governance. Gordon had hated every minute of it. He sat in the meetings rolling his eyes, signing whatever papers were put in front of him so he could get back to his golf game. I, however, had paid attention. At the time, Gordon had a habit of firing developers in fits of rage if they disagreed with him, only to hire them back a week later at a higher rate. It was chaotic and exposed us to wrongful termination lawsuits. I had suggested a clause to the consultants, framing it as a way to protect the company from frivolous claims by disgruntled employees. I suggested that for any executive or director-level suspension to be valid, it had to be preceded by a formal written warning and an independent HR investigation lasting no less than 7 days. If a suspension was issued without these steps, a summary suspension, it would be classified as a breach of contract by the company. I ran my finger over the legal text. In the event of a summary suspension without prior written cause or investigative due process, the executive shall be considered constructively dismissed effective immediately. This action will trigger the full severance package, including the immediate vesting of all outstanding equity and a lump sum payment equivalent to 12 months of salary. Gordon had signed it because he thought it sounded impressive. He thought it applied to other people. He never imagined that his own daughter would be the one to trigger it. He had suspended me verbally. There was no written warning. There was no investigation. He had done it in front of the entire board. I was not just suspended. Legally, I had been fired, and they owed me a fortune. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from my printer. I did not open my laptop yet. I preferred to write the first draft by hand. It helped me filter out the emotion. I wrote the resignation letter. It was 3 sentences long. To the Board of Directors and Human Resources. Pursuant to the events of October 24th and the violation of Section 14, Paragraph C of my employment agreement, I hereby accept my constructive dismissal effectively immediately. Please direct all correspondence regarding my severance and equity payout to my legal counsel. I wish Blackridge Compliance Technologies the best of luck with its future endeavors. Sincerely, Juliet Collins. It was clean. It was sterile. It was a knife made of paper. But I was not done. Leaving was not enough. I had to ensure that when I walked away, the building did not collapse on the innocent people still inside, or, conversely, I had to ensure that the people who lit the match were the only ones who got burned. I opened my laptop. It was my personal MacBook, but it was synced with my corporate cloud account. I knew I had a limited window before Ethan Rowe, the general counsel, instructed it to revoke my credentials. Ethan was slow, usually taking 24 hours to process paperwork, but fear might make him faster. I had to move now. I navigated to the project repository for Project Willow. I did not steal code. I did not delete files. I did exactly what a diligent director of product would do. I exported the logs. I downloaded the scope history. I saved the email threads from 3 months ago where I explicitly told Blair that the encryption module required 6 weeks of testing. I saved her replies, which were mostly variations of "stop being a buzzkill" and "just make it happen." I downloaded the timesheets showing my team working 80-hour weeks for the last 2 months, disproving Gordon's claim that we were padding our time. Then, I went looking for the contract Blair had signed today. I found it in the sales folder, pending countersignature. I opened the PDF, scrolling past the standard boilerplate language until I reached the addendum at the bottom. My breath hitched. I assumed Blair had just promised a 4-week delivery date. That was bad enough. But what I saw on the screen was catastrophic. There, in black and white, was a performance guarantee clause. In the event that Blackridge Compliance Technologies fails to achieve full deployment by November 22nd, the client shall be entitled to a retroactive discount of 20% on the total contract value, and an additional penalty of $10,000 for every day of delay thereafter. I stared at the screen. A 20% penalty would wipe out the entire profit margin of the deal. The daily fine would bleed the company dry within a month. And the worst part, at the bottom of the page, next to Blair's flamboyant signature, was a small box for technical approval. It was blank. She had signed a financial death warrant for the company without the technical team ever seeing the document. She had bet the company's liquidity on a timeline that I knew, with mathematical certainty, was impossible. I took a screenshot. This was no longer just a disagreement about management styles. This was gross negligence. This was a breach of fiduciary duty. I opened my email client. I did not use the corporate Outlook. I used my personal encrypted email. First, I wrote to Imani Brooks. Imani was a contract lawyer I had met at a tech conference 2 years ago. She was sharp, aggressive, and expensive. Subject urgent. Constructive dismissal and severance enforcement. Imani, please review the attached employment contract and the summary of today's events. I have been suspended without process. I believe this triggers the immediate payout clause. Also, please review the non-compete section. I intend to be back in the market by Monday. I need to know my exposure if I send a status report to the board that exposes executive incompetence. J. Next, I wrote to Sasha Wynn. Sasha was the headhunter who had placed me at Blackridge 7 years ago. Back when it was a promising startup and not a nepotistic nightmare, she had called me 6 months ago with an offer from a competitor, and I had turned it down out of loyalty. Subject update. Sasha, you were right. I am ready to talk. Let's do lunch next week. Jay, finally, I began to draft the weapon that would end the war. I opened a new draft. In the to field, I entered the email addresses of the entire board of directors. I added Ethan Rowe. I added the chief financial officer. I added the external auditors. Then, with a steady hand, I added the email address of the client's chief technology officer, the man I had been communicating with honestly until Gordon shut me down. Subject Project Willow. Official status report and risk disclosure. I did not write about my feelings. I did not complain about my father or my sister. I wrote like the engineer I was. I let the data scream. Dear stakeholders, as the Director of Product and Engineering responsible for the architecture of Project Willow, I am sending this final status update to ensure full transparency regarding the deployment timeline and technical risks. 1. Current status. The encryption layer is 40% complete. The security audit has not commenced. 2. Timeline reality. Based on current velocity and regulatory requirements, HIPAA, GDPR, the earliest possible deployment date is January 15th. Any attempt to deploy by November 22nd will result in a product that fails federal compliance standards. 3. Financial risk. I have recently become aware of a penalty clause attached to the sales contract. Please be advised that the engineering department did not review, approve, or sign off on this clause. Given the technical impossibility of the 4-week timeline, the company is statistically guaranteed to incur the maximum financial penalty detailed in the addendum. 4. Resource allocation. My team is currently operating at 120% capacity. Further pressure to meet an artificial deadline will result in critical code errors and potential data loss. Attached are the JIRA logs, the original risk assessment sent to the CEO on October 20th, and the unapproved penalty addendum. I am providing this information to protect the integrity of the product and the legal standing of the company. Regards, Juliet Collins. I read it over. It was devastating. It stripped away the marketing spin and the sales charisma and left only the cold, hard skeleton of the truth. It exposed Blair not just as ambitious, but as reckless. It exposed Gordon not just as a bad father, but as a CEO who was asleep at the wheel. If I sent this now, at 10:00 p.m., they would have all night to spin it. They would have time to call each other, to shout, to formulate a lie. Gordon would call the IT director at home and demand he delete the email from the server before anyone saw it. No, I needed them to see it when they were vulnerable. I needed them to see it when the business day had already started, when the machinery of the corporation was already grinding. I moved my mouse to the arrow next to the send button. Schedule send. I scrolled through the time options. Tomorrow morning, 08:00 a.m., at 8 o'clock, I would be asleep. I planned to sleep in for the first time in 7 years. At 8 o'clock, Gordon would be on his second cup of coffee, feeling smug about teaching me a lesson. At 8 o'clock, Blair would be walking into my office to measure the windows for curtains, and at 8 o'clock, this email would land in 20 inboxes simultaneously, detonating the illusion they had built their lives upon. I clicked schedule. A small notification popped up at the bottom of the screen, message scheduled for tomorrow. 08:00 a.m. I closed the laptop. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel happy. I felt a profound, heavy sense of finality. I had just checkmated my own family. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I poured the wine. I drank it standing up, staring out the window at the lights of Charlotte. The city looked peaceful. It had no idea that a small private apocalypse had just been scheduled for the morning commute. The sun hit my kitchen counter at 7:14 in the morning, a time of day I usually experienced from the inside of a traffic jam on the I-77. For the last decade, my morning routine had been a military drill alarm at 5:30, shower, scalding coffee, and out the door by 6:15 to beat the rush and get a head start on the chaos. Today, however, the apartment was silent. I had slept until 7. It was a strange, heavy sleep, the kind that comes after a fever breaks. I stood in my kitchen wearing silk pajamas, watching the steam rise from my French press. I did not have my work email open on my phone. In fact, my phone was sitting on the counter, face up, next to the sugar bowl. I was not checking for fires to put out. I was waiting for the arson report. My plan was a machine I had built the night before, and the gears were already turning, regardless of whether I watched them or not. At 7:18, the phone buzzed, a single, short vibration. It was Miles. I picked it up, blowing on my coffee. She is here. The text read, "She arrived early. She is wearing the pink suit." I took a sip of coffee. Blair never arrived before 9. The fact that she was there at 7:18 meant she was hungry. She wanted to savor the moment she walked past my office and saw me sitting there, chastised and humiliated. She wanted to see me working for free, accepting my punishment like a good little sister. "She is walking toward your office." Miles texted a minute later. "She is smiling. It is unnerving." I closed my eyes and visualized it. I knew the geography of that floor better than the back of my hand. I could hear the click of her Louboutins on the polished concrete. I could picture the heads of the early bird developers popping up like meerkats, sensing the predator in the room. Blair would be beaming, radiating that toxic positivity she used as a weapon. She was walking toward a victory lap. "She just stopped," came the next text. I smiled into my mug. "She is staring at the desk." Miles wrote, "She looks confused." She would be. My desk was not just clean, it was erased. I had removed the personal touches that made it a workspace. The ergonomic mouse, the pictures, the specific arrangement of notebooks gone. The chair was pushed in tight, the monitors were black. It looked like a desk in a furniture showroom, devoid of human habitation. "She is going in." Miles updated. "She is opening the drawers." This was the violation I had anticipated. Blair had no concept of boundaries. If I wasn't there, she would feel entitled to search my space, looking for a hidden project file, or perhaps a diary she could mock. But she would not find a diary. She would find a single white envelope in the center of the shallow drawer. It was not sealed. Inside was the resignation letter citing the constructive dismissal clause. The phone sat silent for 2 long minutes. The silence stretched, tight as a violin string. "The smile is gone." Miles texted, "She looks like she just swallowed a bug." She is running to her office. She is dialing her phone. My phone began to vibrate immediately. The screen lit up with a photo of my sister. A selfie we had taken years ago at a beach house. Blair calling. I watched it buzz. I took another sip of coffee. The vibration rattled the spoon on the counter. I did not answer. The call went to voicemail. 3 seconds later, it rang again. Dad calling. I let that one go to voicemail too. I looked at the clock on the microwave. It was 7:58. The real bomb had not even detonated yet. The resignation was just a noise complaint. The email I had scheduled the night before, the one attached to the board members, the auditors, and the client, was the structural demolition. I walked over to my laptop, which was open on the dining table. The screensaver was active. I woke it up. The email client was open. Scheduled today, 8 o'clock in the morning. I watched the seconds tick over on the digital clock in the corner of the screen. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Message sent. The notification appeared briefly in the corner, a small blue rectangle that vanished in a blink. It was such a small thing, a few kilobytes of data, yet, as I watched it disappear, I felt a physical sensation of vertigo. Like stepping off a ledge, there was no unsending it. The truth was now sitting in 20 different inboxes. It was on the server of the external law firm. It was on the phone of the client's CTO. I sat down at the table and waited. It took exactly 4 minutes for the shockwave to hit. My phone did not just vibrate, it had a seizure. It danced across the countertop. Dad calling, Blair calling, unknown number, Dad calling. I let them ring. I was not hiding. I was letting them read. I wanted them to get through the first paragraph. I wanted them to see the timeline analysis. I wanted them to see the penalty clause that Blair had signed. I wanted the reality of the numbers to sink in before I added the complication of my voice. At 8:12, a different name appeared on the screen. Ethan Rowe, General Counsel. This was the call I had to take. Ethan was the company lawyer, not the family lawyer. His duty was to the corporation, not to Gordon's ego. If he was calling, it meant the legal department had been alerted. The dominoes were falling exactly as the logic dictated. I picked up the phone. "Good morning. Ethan," I said. My voice was calm, surprising even myself. "Juliet." Ethan sounded like he had just run up 10 flights of stairs. His voice was breathless and pitched an octave higher than usual. "Please tell me you did not send that email to the client. Please tell me it is stuck in the outbox. It is sent, Ethan." I said, "I copied the board and the external auditors. You should have received it as well." There was a choking sound on the other end of the line. I heard the rustle of papers, the frantic clicking of a mouse. "Juliet, do you have any idea what you have done?" he hissed. "You just exposed the company to a massive liability lawsuit. You just handed the client evidence of breach of contract before the contract has even been executed fully. You have breached your fiduciary duty." "Stop." I cut him off. My tone was sharp enough to slice glass. "Do not talk to me about fiduciary duty. Ethan, fiduciary duty is acting in the best interest of the company. My sister signed a penalty clause that guarantees a 20% revenue loss and daily fines because she fabricated a timeline that defies the laws of physics. She did this without technical review. Gordon approved it without reading it." I took a breath, letting the silence hang for a beat. I did not breach my duty. I continued. I reported a material risk that was being actively concealed by executive leadership. If I had stayed silent, that would have been negligence. I am an officer of the company. Ethan, I am required to report risk. Ethan went silent. He was a good lawyer. He knew I was right. He knew that now that the auditors had the email, he could not bury it. If he tried to cover it up now, he would be an accomplice. "Juliet," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Gordon is... he is incandescent. He is screaming for security to escort you out. But you aren't even here. I am not there because I was constructively dismissed yesterday." I reminded him, "You have my resignation letter. It is on Blair's desk. Or maybe she ripped it up by now. But you have the email copy. Section 14, paragraph C. I am looking at it." Ethan admitted. He sounded tired. "Look, we need to contain this. You cannot just throw a grenade and walk away. The board is already calling me. Marianne Holt is on the other line." "Good," I said. "That is the system working." "Juliet, you need to come in," he said. "We need to have a meeting. Immediately. We need to figure out a statement for the client before they sue us." I looked at my fingernails. They were steady. I am not an employee anymore. "Ethan, I have no obligation to come in. Please," he said. And for the first time, I heard genuine fear in his voice. It wasn't fear of me. It was fear of what would happen to the company if I didn't help them navigate the mess I had just illuminated. If we don't fix the narrative with the client by noon, the stock valuation for the internal buyback will tank. You still hold equity. Juliet, you want that stock to be worth something. He had a point. I didn't want to burn the company to the ground. I wanted to burn the corruption out of it. Fine, I said. I will come in, but not for a family chat in Gordon's office. Name your terms, Ethan said quickly. 9 o'clock in the morning. I said, the main boardroom, not Gordon's office. I want the full board present, or at least a quorum. I want you there to record the minutes officially. Done, Ethan said. And Ethan, I added, yes, no private meetings before the main session. I do not want Gordon cornering me in the hallway. I do not want Blair coming to the parking lot. If they approach me without a witness, I leave, and I call the Department of Labor. I will meet you at the elevator myself. Ethan promised. Just get here. I hung up the phone. I stood there for a moment in the quiet of my apartment. The adrenaline was starting to seep into my bloodstream now, making my hands tingle. I had done it. I had pulled the trigger. I walked to my bedroom to get dressed. I did not put on the gray blend-in blazer I usually wore. I chose a navy blue dress, sharp and tailored, with a high neck. It was armor. As I was putting on my earrings, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from Miles. The floor is freaking out. Gordon just smashed a coffee mug in the hallway. He is shouting your name. Legal just ran into his office. It looks like a hostage situation down here. I typed back a single word. Steady. I grabbed my purse, my keys, and the folder Aunt Renee had sent over, which had arrived by courier 10 minutes ago. I had not opened it yet, but I could feel the weight of it in my hand. It felt dense, like a brick of lead. I drove to the office in silence. The radio felt too frivolous. The city passed by in a blur of gray and green. When I pulled into the parking lot of Blackridge Compliance Technologies, I saw Blair's Porsche parked diagonally across 2 spaces, a testament to her state of mind. I parked my sedan in my assigned spot, the one that still had my name stenciled on the concrete. J. Collins. Ethan was waiting for me in the lobby. Just as he had promised. He looked pale. His tie was slightly askew, which for Ethan was the equivalent of running around naked. Juliet, he said, rushing forward as I walked through the revolving doors. Thank God, it is a bloodbath upstairs. I walked past the receptionist, who stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Let's go. I said to Ethan. We got into the elevator. He pressed the button for the executive floor. As the doors slid shut, enclosing us in the small metal box, he turned to me. Gordon wants to fire you for cause, he whispered. He is trying to say the email was a malicious breach of confidentiality. He wants to void your severance. I looked at the floor indicator numbers lighting up. 1, 2, 3. He can try, I said calmly. But he is forgetting one thing. What Ethan asked. I cannot breach confidentiality by sending data to the client that belongs to the client, I said. I sent them their own project status, and I sent the board internal financial risks. That is whistleblower protection. Ethan, if he fires me for cause now, it is retaliation. You know that. Ethan rubbed his temples. I know. I told him that. He isn't listening. He is hurt. Juliet, he thinks you betrayed the family. The elevator chimed at the 4th floor. The doors opened. I stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive wing. The air smelled of tension and stale coffee. Down the hall, I could hear a voice raised in anger, my father's voice. I looked at Ethan. I did not betray the family. I said, adjusting my grip on the folder. I just stopped lying for it. I walked toward the boardroom. The glass walls were ahead. I could see them inside. Gordon was pacing, his face a mask of red fury. Blair was sitting at the table, her head in her hands. Marianne Holt was reading a printout of my email, her face unreadable. I pushed the door open. The conversation inside cut off instantly. Every head turned toward me. Gordon stopped pacing. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the father who used to push me on the swings. But then the CEO mask slammed back down, twisted by rage. You, he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. I did not flinch. I walked to the end of the table, opposite him. I placed the folder on the mahogany surface. Good morning, I said. My voice did not shake. Shall we begin? The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom remained open behind me, but the room itself was in a state of suspended animation. The board of directors sat around the table like statues in a museum, waiting for the performance to begin. However, one chair was conspicuously empty, the leather seat to the right of my father. The place always reserved for the heir apparent was vacant. Blair was not there. I knew exactly where she was. My sister had never been one to face a firing squad without trying to find a human shield first. She would be looking for leverage. She would be looking for the one thing she believed had to exist: a secret file, a hidden backup, or a real plan that I had tucked away to save the day at the last minute. She could not conceive of a world where I simply let her fail. I turned to Ethan Rowe. "I cannot start without the vice president of sales," I said, keeping my voice low and level. It would be unfair to discuss her performance in absentia. "I will go get her." Ethan looked like he wanted to object, to keep me safely contained in the boardroom, but he nodded weakly. I walked out of the executive suite and stepped onto the engineering floor. If the atmosphere in the boardroom was tense, the atmosphere on the development floor was electric. As I swiped my badge, which, surprisingly, still worked, and pushed through the glass double doors, the hum of conversation died instantly. It was as if someone had cut the power cable to the entire room. I walked down the main aisle. Usually, this walk was a blur of greeting developers, checking scrum boards, and dodging Nerf darts. Today, it felt like walking through a cathedral during a funeral. 50 heads turned in my direction. I felt their eyes on me. They were not looking at their monitors. They were looking at the woman who had just nuked the executive leadership from her kitchen table. I saw a mixture of emotions in their gazes. There was fear. Certainly, layoffs often followed executive wars, but there was also curiosity, and in the eyes of the senior engineers, there was something else: respect. Perhaps even a grim sort of vindication. They had been suffering under Blair's impossible promises for 2 years. Someone had finally said no. Miles Carter stood by the server room door. He did not wave. He just gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. I reached my office at the end of the hall. The door was wide open. I could hear the sounds of destruction before I even crossed the threshold. Drawers were being yanked open and slammed shut. Papers were being shuffled aggressively. I stepped into the doorway and leaned against the frame. "You will not find it." "Blair," I said. My sister spun around. She looked like a hurricane had hit a fashion runway. Her immaculate blonde hair was slightly frizzy at the temples, a sign she had been running her hands through it. Her face was flushed a deep, blotchy red that clashed with her pink suit. She was holding a stapler in one hand and a stack of old quarterly reports in the other, looking for something that did not exist. "Where is it?" she demanded, her voice shrill. She threw the reports onto the desk, where they slid off and scattered across the floor. "Where is the shadow schedule?" "Juliet, I know you have one. You always have a plan B. You always have a sandbox version where you fix everything. There is no shadow schedule," I replied calmly. I did not move from the doorway. I watched her unravel. It was fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. "Don't lie to me," she screamed. She abandoned the desk and moved to the filing cabinet, ripping it open. "You are doing this to humiliate me. You sent that email to the client just to make me look incompetent. You are trying to destroy this company because you are jealous that Dad picked me." I walked into the room, stepping carefully over the scattered papers. "I did not send that email to hurt you, Blair," I said. "I sent it to save myself from being sued for fraud. And I am not destroying the company. You did that the moment you signed a contract guaranteeing a product delivery in 4 weeks that requires 12 weeks to build." Blair slammed the filing cabinet drawer shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. She marched toward me, stopping only inches away. She was taller than me in her heels, and she used that height now, looming over me. "I am going to sue you," she hissed. Her eyes were wet, but not with sadness. They were wet with rage. "You leaked internal confidential information to an external party. That is a violation of your NDA. Dad is going to bury you in legal fees. You will never work in this industry again." I shook my head slowly. I did not leak trade secrets. Blair, I did not send them the source code. I did not send them the encryption keys or the client list. I sent them a project status report. I sent them the risk assessment regarding their own data. I took a step closer to her, forcing her to step back. And more importantly, I continued, I exposed a financial liability that you created. The whistleblower statutes are very clear on this. I am protected. You, however, are not. Blair let out a frustrated sound, halfway between a growl and a sob. She turned away from me, pacing the small length of the office. She was desperate for an angle, a way to twist the narrative back to where she was the victim and I was the villain. We had an agreement, she shouted, spinning back to face me. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. We talked about this at lunch last Tuesday. You said we could crunch. You said if we put the whole team on overtime, we could make the beta version work. You agreed to it, Juliet. You gave me your verbal approval. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. It was her classic move. She would rewrite history, counting on the fact that no one recorded conversations over salad. She expected me to get flustered, to argue about he said, she said. I did not argue. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I unlocked it and opened our Slack conversation history. I tapped the search bar and typed lunch. I turned the screen toward her. I texted you immediately after that lunch. I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I read the message aloud. Blair, regarding what we discussed at lunch, putting the team on overtime will not solve the encryption latency. We still need 12 weeks. Do not promise an earlier date. I scrolled down, and here is your reply. Time stamped at 2:14 in the afternoon on Tuesday. Stop being such a buzzkill. Jules. Just make it work. I looked at her over the top of the phone. There was no verbal agreement. Blair, there was you ignoring me, and me documenting it. Digital forensics is a beautiful thing. It does not care about your feelings or your memory. It only cares about the data. Blair stared at the screen. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at her own avatar next to the dismissive message. The reality of her situation was finally piercing the bubble of her delusion. She could not charm her way out of a timestamp. She slumped against the edge of my desk, the fight draining out of her. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Her voice was small now, reverting to the tone of the little sister who used to ask me to do her homework. Why do you hate me? I felt a flicker of pity, but I extinguished it immediately. That pity was the trap I had fallen into for 30 years. I do not hate you, Blair, I said softly. But I am done setting myself on fire to keep you warm. At that moment, a tentative knock sounded on the open door. We both turned. It was Timothy, Gordon's executive assistant. He looked terrified, clutching a clipboard to his chest like a shield. Ms. Collins, he squeaked, looking back and forth between us. The board is waiting. Your father, Mr. Collins, he is asking for both of you immediately. I nodded at Timothy. Thank you. Timothy, we are coming. I turned back to Blair. She was still leaning against the desk, looking defeated. She looked young and lost, and for a second, I wanted to reach out and fix her collar. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but it wouldn't be okay. Not unless she faced the consequences of her actions. Fix your hair, I said. You are the vice president. Look the part. I did not wait for her. I turned and walked out of the office. I walked back down the aisle of the engineering floor. The developers were still watching, but now, the silence felt different. It felt like anticipation. They saw me walking alone. They saw that I was not crying. They saw that I was not being escorted out by security. I heard the click-clack of Blair's heels hurrying to catch up behind me. Usually, in these situations, I would slow down. I would wait for her. I would let her walk beside me so we could present a united front. I would let her take the lead so she could feel important. Not today. I kept my pace steady and fast. I walked with my head up. Blair had to jog slightly to close the distance, but I did not slow down. She fell into step 3 paces behind me. For the first time in our lives, the order was reversed. I was not the shadow walking behind the golden child. I was the vanguard. I was the one clearing the path. I reached the double doors of the executive suite and pushed them open. I held the door for a brief second, just enough so it wouldn't hit her in the face, but not long enough to be polite. She slipped through, breathless and disheveled. She looked at the back of my head, and I could feel her confusion radiating in waves. She was realizing that the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had evaporated. I was no longer playing her game. I was playing a game she did not even know the rules to. I walked toward the boardroom, the folder of evidence under my arm, leaving my sister to walk in my wake. The atmosphere inside the boardroom had shifted fundamentally from the chaotic, emotional theater of yesterday, when I had walked out 24 hours ago. It had been a family argument spilling over into a business setting. Now, as I took my seat at the far end of the table, opposite my father, the room felt sterile, dangerous, and distinctly legal. The first thing I noticed was the red light on the center console of the conference phone. It was steady and unblinking. Recording in progress. Ethan Rowe announced, his voice tight. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his notepad. We also have a stenographer present via video link to ensure the minutes are verbatim. This is an official special session of the Board of Directors of Black Ridge Compliance Technologies. Gordon sat at the head of the table. He was not shouting. He was gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. He looked like a man who was trying to hold back a tidal wave with sheer willpower. Blair sat to his right, looking smaller than usual. Her earlier fury in my office replaced by a nervous fidgeting. She kept glancing at the recording device, realizing too late that her usual tactics of gaslighting and emotional manipulation would not work when every syllable was being transcribed for legal posterity. I did not open with a greeting. I did not ask how everyone was doing. I reached into my leather portfolio and withdrew a single, crisp white envelope. I slid it across the polished mahogany surface. It traveled the length of the table with a soft hissing sound, coming to rest exactly in front of the general counsel. My formal resignation, I stated. The volume of my voice was low, but in the acoustically treated room, it carried perfectly, effective immediately. Gordon let out a short, derisive snort. He leaned forward, breaking his statue-like pose. "Stop this. Juliet," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You are being dramatic. You are acting like a teenager throwing a tantrum because she got grounded. We are not accepting your resignation. You are suspended. That stands. You take your 2 weeks, you cool off, and you come back when you are ready to be a team player." I looked at him. I did not see my father. I saw a CEO who had forgotten to read the employee handbook. "I am not being dramatic." "Gordon," I replied, using his first name. The shock on his face was immediate. "I am being contractual, and you do not have the option to refuse." I turned my gaze to Ethan. "Ethan, please read the clause regarding suspension without cause found in my executive employment agreement. Specifically, Section 14, Paragraph C." Ethan hesitated. He looked at Gordon, then at the envelope, then at me. He knew exactly what was in there. He had probably spent the last hour frantically reviewing it after receiving my email. "Read it, Ethan," I commanded softly. Ethan cleared his throat. He opened his laptop, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled. Section 14, Paragraph C. Ethan read, his voice dry. "In the event of a summary suspension of an executive officer without a prior written warning and a formal investigative period of no less than 7 days, such action shall be deemed a constructive dismissal without cause." He paused. The room was silent. "Go on," I said. Ethan swallowed hard. "Upon such constructive dismissal, the executive is entitled to the full severance package. This includes 12 months of base salary, the immediate payout of all accrued bonuses, and—" He stopped again, looking up at Gordon with eyes full of apology. "And what?" Ethan Gordon barked. "Spit it out. And the accelerated vesting of all outstanding stock options and equity grants, effective as of the date of dismissal." Ethan finished. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lung. Gordon's face went from red to a pale, waxen gray. He knew the numbers. He knew exactly how much equity I had been granted over 7 years of building his products. Those options were designed to vest over a 10-year period to keep me chained to the company. By suspending me yesterday without paperwork, he had inadvertently handed me the key to the vault. That is absurd, Gordon sputtered, looking around the table at the other board members for support. I suspended her for insubordination. That is cause I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. Insubordination requires a documented refusal of a lawful order. I corrected him. You suspended me because I presented a risk assessment you did not like. You did not file a warning. You did not involve HR. You simply reacted, and in doing so, you triggered the clause. I looked at the board members. Legally, I was fired yesterday morning. I said, I am just here to collect the check and ensure the transition of the compliance logs. Gordon slammed his hand on the table. It was a violent, desperate sound. Who wrote that, he demanded, turning on Ethan. Who put that poison pill in her contract? Did you do this? Ethan. Are you working for her? Ethan shrank back. No, sir. It was part of the standard executive template adopted during the restructuring 3 years ago. I spoke up before Ethan could take the fall. I wrote it. Gordon? Gordon's head snapped toward me. His eyes were wide with betrayal. You, he whispered. You set me up. You have been planning this for 3 years. I shook my head slowly. I did not write it for me. I said, I wrote it for the employees. Do you remember the summer of 2021? You fired the vice president of marketing because she wore a dress you did not like to a client dinner. You suspended the lead architect because he corrected your grammar in a meeting. I gestured to the room. I insisted on that clause to protect the company from impulsive, emotional leadership. I said, I wanted to ensure that if you ever decided to destroy someone's career on a whim, there would be a penalty to make you think twice. I never imagined I would be the one to use it. I assumed I was safe because I was your daughter. I paused, letting the words land. I was wrong. Blair, who had been vibrating with suppressed energy, finally exploded. This is blackmail, she shrieked. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You are extorting the family. You think you can just rob us and walk away? She looked at the board members, her eyes wild. She is trying to bankrupt us because she is jealous. You cannot let her get away with this. We will fight this in court. We will sue her for everything. Sit down. Blair, Ethan said. His voice was sharp, cutting through her hysteria. Don't tell me to sit down, Blair yelled. You are the lawyer. Do something I cannot do anything because she is right. Ethan said, his voice weary. It is a binding contract. Blair, if we fight this in court, we will lose. And the discovery phase will reveal that the suspension was retaliatory. We would be paying her legal fees on top of the settlement. Blair looked at him as if he had slapped her. She sank back into her chair. Defeated, Gordon was breathing heavily. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. He had always wanted a killer in the boardroom. He just never expected the gun to be pointed at him. Fine, Gordon spat. Gordon, you want your money. Take it. Take the severance. We will buy back your shares at the current valuation. But you sign a non-disclosure agreement. You never speak about this company again. And you retract that email you sent this morning. I did not blink. No. The single word hung in the air. Excuse me, Gordon asked, his voice dangerous. I will not retract the email. I said, because the email is the truth. I opened the folder I had brought with me. I pulled out the printed copies of the email, the JIRA logs, and the sales contract Blair had signed. I am not here to negotiate my severance. I said, the severance is already mine by law. I am here to discuss the liability this company is currently facing. Marianne Holt, the independent board member who sat at the far end of the table, cleared her throat. She was a woman in her 60s, a former CFO of a Fortune 500 company. She was the only person in the room Gordon actually feared, because she represented the external investors. Ms. Collins is correct, Marianne said. Her voice was cool and detached. I have reviewed the email and the attachments she sent this morning. Marianne took off her reading glasses and looked directly at Gordon. Gordon, the issue here is not the severance package. That is pocket change compared to what we are looking at. The issue is that your vice president of sales signed a penalty clause that guarantees a loss, and you approved it without technical due diligence. Marianne tapped the paper in front of her. Juliet's email does not look like a breach of confidentiality to me. She continued. It looks like a mandatory risk disclosure. If she hadn't sent this, and the project failed as predicted, we would all be liable for shareholder fraud. Gordon looked at Marianne, stunned. He had expected the board to circle the wagons around him. He had expected them to view me as the disgruntled employee. She humiliated us, Gordon insisted, his voice losing its power. She sent it to the client. She sent the client the truth about the timeline, Marianne countered, which, frankly, is the only thing that might save us from a lawsuit when we miss the November deadline. She managed expectations that you and Blair failed to manage. Marianne turned her gaze to me. There was no warmth in it, but there was professional acknowledgement. However, she added, sending it to the external auditors was a nuclear option. Juliet, you have forced an investigation. That was the point. I said simply. Gordon looked between us. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the boardroom was no longer his living room. He could not shout this problem away. He could not charm it away. He was trapped in a web of legal obligations and financial consequences. He looked at me, and I saw the realization hit him. He had suspended me to teach me a lesson about power. He wanted to show me that he held all the cards, but by pushing me out, he had stripped me of the chains of loyalty. He had freed me to use the very tools I had built to protect him against him. So, I said, breaking the silence, we have established that my resignation is valid and my severance is triggered. Now, we need to discuss how you are going to address the fraud regarding the Project Willow contract. Fraud, Blair whispered. She looked pale. I didn't commit fraud. It was sales puffery. Everyone does it. Signing a financial penalty clause based on data you knew was false is not puffery. Blair, I said, it is material misrepresentation. And since Gordon countersigned it, it is systemic. Ethan Rowe put his head in his hands. Gordon stared at me. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, hard calculation. He was looking at me not as his daughter, but as an enemy combatant who had just breached the perimeter. You are enjoying this, aren't you? Gordon asked softly. I looked at the empty seat where I used to sit. I looked at the whiteboard where I used to draw diagrams to save his bad ideas. No, I said honestly, I am not enjoying it. It is tragic. But for the first time in my life, I am not the one paying the price for your mistakes. I turned back to Ethan. I want the severance agreement drafted and signed by the end of the business day. I want the wire transfer initiated within 24 hours. And regarding the investigation into the contract, I tapped the folder again. I am willing to cooperate with the auditors, fully. Gordon flinched. He knew what that meant. It meant I would not just answer questions. I would provide the map to the bodies. This meeting is adjourned, Gordon announced abruptly. He stood up, knocking his chair back. He could not stand to look at me for another second. Get out of my boardroom. I stood up slowly. I smoothed down the front of my dress. It is not your boardroom. Gordon, I said quietly, it belongs to the shareholders. And right now, I think they have a lot of questions for you. I turned and walked toward the door. I did not look back at Blair, who was weeping silently. I did not look back at my father, who was staring at the wall as if trying to burn a hole through it. I walked out past the stenographer, who was typing furiously, capturing every second of the Collins family collapse. Gordon tried to dismiss the room, his voice booming with the command to adjourn, but the room did not obey. The heavy oak door I had been walking toward remained closed. Marianne Holt had not gathered her papers. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the folder I had placed on the table. Sit down. Gordon, Marianne said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of the pension funds and institutional investors she represented. We are not finished, Ms. Collins has raised allegations of material misrepresentation. As a fiduciary board, we are legally required to review the evidence immediately. Gordon froze. He looked at Marianne, then at the other board members. He saw no allies. He saw only men and women terrified of litigation. Slowly, stiffly, he sat back down. I did not sit. I walked to the head of the table, not to the chair, but to the audio-visual console. I plugged the HDMI cable into my laptop. The large screen behind Gordon flickered to life, casting a blue glow over his flushed face. I pulled up the slide deck I had prepared the night before. It was titled Project Willow Variance Analysis. I am going to show you 2 timelines, I said, clicking the remote. The screen split into 2 columns. The left column was colored and cool, clinical blue. The right column was a chaotic mess of bright red. On the left is the engineering roadmap approved by the technical team in August, I explained, using my laser pointer to circle the dates. This roadmap accounts for 3 rounds of security penetration testing, a beta release to a control group, and a final code freeze on December 10th. This puts us live on January 15th. I moved the laser to the red column. On the right is the timeline Blair sold to the client yesterday. The difference was comical if it weren't so tragic. The red column had no testing phase. It had no code freeze. It simply went from development to live in a span of 4 weeks. But the timeline is not the only issue. I continued, clicking to the next slide. This is where the fraud becomes actionable. The screen changed to a list of features. This is what we call scope creep. I said, in software development, scope creep is when you add features without adding time or resources. Usually, it is a nuisance. Here, it is fatal. I pointed to the first item on the list, real-time biometric authentication. We do not have a biometric engine, I stated flatly. We license a third-party tool for that, which takes 6 weeks to integrate. Blair promised it would be native and ready in 3 weeks. I pointed to the second item, historical data migration for 10 years of records. Our servers are not configured for that volume of data ingestion. I explained, to do this, we would need to rebuild the entire database architecture. That is a 3-month job. Blair promised it as a free add-on to close the deal. I looked at my sister. She was staring at the table, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. Blair, I said, did you ask anyone in engineering if we could build a biometric engine in 3 weeks? She didn't look up. The client asked for it. She mumbled. They said the competitor had it. I had to say yes to lock them in. You didn't have to say yes. I corrected her. You chose to say yes because you knew I would be the one expected to stay awake for 20 days straight to figure it out. I turned back to the screen. I pulled up a series of emails. This is the documentation of the warnings. I said, I opened an email dated September 12th. The subject line was urgent. Capacity warning. Project Willow. To Blair Collins. Gordon Collins. From Juliet Collins. Body. The team is currently at 110% utilization. If we add any more features to the scope, we will miss the compliance audit window. We cannot sacrifice QA for features. I open the next one. Dated October 4th. To Blair Collins. Body Blair. I see you are pitching the predictive analytics module. Please stop. We have not built it yet. It is vaporware. If you sell it, we are selling a lie. I looked at Ethan Rowe. The general counsel was reading the screen, his lips moving silently as he parsed the text. He looked ill. You were told, Ethan whispered. He looked up at Gordon. She warned you in writing, multiple times. September, October. This establishes knowledge. You cannot claim ignorance. Gordon shifted in his chair. He was sweating now, a sheen of perspiration visible on his forehead under the harsh boardroom lights. She is cherry-picking emails, Gordon argued weakly. We talk all the time. I told her to be more flexible. I told her that we are a sales-driven organization, not an engineering commune. I turned to him. Flexible is asking the team to work a Saturday. Gordon, flexible is not asking us to invent a time machine. Gordon slammed his fist on the armrest. Then why didn't you come to me? He shouted. Why didn't you walk into my office and look me in the eye and say, Dad, this is going to kill the company? Why hide behind emails? The room went silent. It was the question of a desperate father trying to make this a family failure rather than a corporate one. I looked at him, and for a moment, I felt the old urge to apologize, to take the blame, to keep the peace. But the peace was already gone. I did come to you, I said. My voice was very quiet, very steady. I walked into your office on October 10th. It was a Thursday. You were putting on your golf shoes. I had the capacity charts in my hand. I started to show you the red lines. I told you that Blair was promising things that were physically impossible. I took a step closer to him. Do you remember what you said to me? Gordon. He stared at me, his jaw working. He remembered. I could see it in his eyes. You didn't even look up from your shoes. I said, you told me. Juliet, stop being such a wet blanket. Your sister is out there hunting. Your job is to cook what she catches. Don't bore me with the details. I let that hang in the air. You didn't want the truth. I said, you wanted the feeling of success. You wanted to believe Blair's fairy tale because it made you feel like a winner. My facts just made you feel tired. Marianne Holt cleared her throat. It sounded like a gavel banging. Let's move to the financial exposure, she said, cutting through the emotional fog. The email this morning mentioned a penalty clause. I clicked the remote. The screen displayed the PDF of the contract addendum, the paragraph detailing the 20% discount, and the daily $10,000 fine was highlighted in yellow. This is the document that was sent to the client yesterday, I said. Ethan leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Who authorized this? He asked. His voice was sharp. This is non-standard language. We never agreed to liquidated damages on a software timeline. It is suicide. I looked at Blair. Blair, I asked. She looked up, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. It was a standard template the client sent over. She stammered. They said their legal team required it. I didn't think it was a big deal. We were going to hit the date anyway. You didn't run it by legal, Ethan asked, horrified. I didn't have time, Blair cried. They were going to walk. I had to sign it right there. Ethan put his head in his hands. But you are just a vice president, Marianne pointed out. Her voice was icy. You do not have the signature authority to bind the company to a penalty of this magnitude without CEO approval. That is in the bylaws. Marianne turned her gaze to Gordon. Gordon, did you see this addendum? Gordon stiffened. I knew they were negotiating terms. Blair told me she had to give a little on the back end to get the upfront payment. I trusted her judgment. So you didn't sign it? Marianne asked. No, Gordon said quickly. I didn't sign that specific page. I clicked the remote one last time. The screen changed to an email thread. From Blair Collins to Gordon Collins. Subject FW. Contract addendum. Penalty clause. Date, yesterday. 4:12 p.m. Dad, the client is pushing for this penalty clause if we miss the date. It is just a formality because we are going to crush the timeline anyway. Need your green light to sign. B. And below it, the reply. From Gordon Collins to Blair Collins. REFW contract addendum. Penalty clause. Okay, 2 letters, lowercase, no signature block, sent from an iPhone. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hovering at the top of its track. I looked at my father. He was staring at the screen, his face draining of all color. He looked old. He looked like a man watching his own house burn down because he had been too lazy to check the wiring. That is your approval. Gordon, I said, you authorized the risk. You bypassed legal review. You bypassed technical review. You bet the company's entire fourth quarter profit on a gamble. And you put it in writing. Ethan Rowe spoke up. His voice was trembling. Gordon, he said, this changes everything. What do you mean? Gordon whispered. If we miss this deadline, and Juliet has proven we will, the client will enforce these penalties. The stock will tank. And because you bypassed the corporate bylaws regarding signature authority and due diligence. Ethan took a breath. The shareholders can sue you personally, Ethan said. They can pierce the corporate veil. They can come after your assets. They can argue that you and Blair were not acting as officers of the company, but as rogue agents acting with gross negligence. This isn't just a bad quarter. This is liability for misleading investors. Gordon looked at me. For the first time, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear. It wasn't the fear of embarrassment anymore. It was the primal fear of losing everything he owned. You have to fix this, he stammered, looking at me. Juliet, you can fix this. You always fix it. You can pull the team together. You can work the weekends. We can make the date. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had suspended me 24 hours ago to teach me respect. I looked at the man who had pitted me against my sister for our entire lives. He still didn't get it. He still thought I was a resource he could tap. He still thought he could abuse me and then ask me to clean up the blood because we were family. I unplugged the HDMI cable. The screen went black. I cannot fix it. Gordon, I said, because the math does not care about your desperation. 12 weeks is 12 weeks. I began to gather my papers. I put the resignation letter back in my portfolio. I put the flash drive with the logs in my pocket. And more importantly, I added, looking him dead in the eye, I will not fix it. I picked up my purse. I am not an employee of Blackridge Compliance Technologies. I am a constructive dismissal case with a severance package to collect. I will not be here to clean up the mess for a promise I never made, authorized by a signature I never gave. I looked at the board members. I will be at my apartment. My lawyer will be in touch regarding the wire transfer. I turned my back on them. Juliet Gordon screamed. It was a raw, terrified sound. Don't you walk out on me. I kept walking. I walked past the empty chair. I walked past the stunned stenographer. I walked out of the heavy doors and let them close behind me, muffling the sound of the panic that was finally, rightfully, consuming them. I walked out of the office building and into the humid heat of the North Carolina afternoon. My hands were shaking. It was not from fear, but from the sudden, violent crash of adrenaline that follows a confrontation. I had just dismantled the mythology of my own family in a room full of strangers, and the silence in my head was deafening. I did not go to my car. I could not sit in a confined space yet. Instead, I walked to a small concrete bench situated near the decorative fountain in the plaza. The water jets were firing in a rhythmic, predictable pattern, a mathematical sequence that usually calmed me. Today, it just looked like a loop that went nowhere. I sat down, placing my purse on the hot concrete beside me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my heart rate. I had won. Legally, I had won. I had the severance. I had the moral high ground, and I had escaped. But it felt less like a victory and more like an amputation. A shadow fell over me. I looked up, squinting against the sun. Aunt Renee was standing there. She was wearing a floral dress that looked out of place among the gray suits of the business district. She held 2 coffees in a cardboard carrier and a thick manila envelope tucked under her arm. She did not look surprised to see me sitting there. She looked like a woman who had checked the schedule and arrived exactly on time. You did it, she said. It was not a question. I nodded. Taking the coffee she offered, I resigned. I triggered the severance clause. I showed them the data. Renee sat down next to me. She took a sip of her coffee, staring at the glass facade of the Blackridge building. And how did Gordon take it, she asked. He tried to make me feel small. I said, then he tried to make me feel guilty. Then, when he realized the liability I had exposed, he looked terrified. Renee hummed, a low sound of satisfaction. Good. Fear is the only language Gordon Collins has ever respected. He interprets kindness as weakness and silence as submission. You finally spoke a language he understands. She placed the manila envelope on her lap. It was sealed with heavy packing tape. On the front, in handwriting that made my breath hitch in my throat, was my name, Juliet. It was my mother's handwriting. The loops of the J and the sharp cross of the T were unmistakable. I had not seen that script in 5 years, not since the condolence cards she had written for others, and the grocery lists she had left on the fridge. What is this? I asked, my voice trembling. Renee placed her hand on the envelope. Your mother gave this to me 3 weeks before she died, Renee said softly. She made me swear on my life that I would only give it to you if 2 conditions were met. First, You had to be pushed out of the company. Second, you had to be ready to stop protecting them. I looked at the envelope. I thought the files you sent yesterday were everything. I said, the ledger, the history of the bias. That was the context, Renee explained. That was to help you understand that you weren't crazy. This is the contingency. She pushed the envelope toward me. Open it. I set my coffee down. I used my fingernail to slice through the tape. Inside, there was a leather-bound journal and a blue legal folder. I pulled out the journal first. It smelled of her perfume, a faint scent of lavender and old paper. I opened it to a marked page. My dearest Jules, if you are reading this, it means the day I feared has finally come. It means your father has chosen his ego over your well-being, and he has used the company to break you. I am so sorry I'm not there to stand between you and him. I have watched you for years, my brilliant, stoic girl. I have watched you clean up Blair's messes. I have watched you take Gordon's criticism while he gives Blair the praise. I stayed because I thought I could mitigate it. I thought if I was there, I could keep the scales balanced. But I know that when I am gone, the balance will break. Gordon is a builder, but he is also a user. He uses people until they are empty, and then he discards them. He will try to do this to you. He will try to make you a permanent servant to Blair's ambition. I cannot stop him from the grave, but I can give you a shield. And if you need it, I can give you a sword. Read the legal document. Juliet, read the trust agreement carefully. I didn't leave my shares to Gordon. I left them to the family, with conditions. I love you. You are the strong one. Do not let them tell you otherwise. Mom. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and fast. I wiped them away angrily. I could not afford to cry right now. I needed to understand what she had left me. I opened the blue legal folder. It was a copy of the Collins Family Irrevocable Trust. I knew about the trust. Of course, it held the 40% of the company stock that my mother had owned. Since her death, those shares had been voted by Gordon, giving him absolute control when combined with his own 20%. I flipped through the dense legal jargon until I found a section flagged with a yellow sticky note. Article 9 Voting Rights and Contingency of Control. I read the paragraph. Then I read it again. Then I read it a third time, my engineer's brain dismantling the logic and reassembling it to ensure I wasn't hallucinating. The voting rights associated with the Class A shares held in this trust are granted to the trustee, Gordon Collins, for the duration of his tenure as CEO. However, in the event that the company is found to be in a state of material governance failure, defined specifically as the concealment of material risks from the board of directors or the active misrepresentation of contractual capabilities to clients. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. Then the voting rights for the trust shares shall immediately and temporarily transfer to the beneficiary, Juliet Collins, for the sole purpose of appointing an independent auditor and restructuring the executive leadership. I looked up at Renee. She was watching me closely. Did you know about this? I asked. I was the witness when she signed it. Renee said, Your mother knew Gordon. She knew he cut corners. She knew that one day he might cut a corner so sharp he would crash the car. She wanted to make sure that if that happened, he couldn't take your inheritance down with him. She wanted to give you the emergency brake. I looked back at the document. The language was precise. Active misrepresentation of contractual capabilities. That is exactly what happened today, I whispered. Blair signed a contract promising features we don't have. Gordon approved a penalty clause based on a timeline that is a lie, and I just presented the evidence to the board. Renee nodded, which means the condition is triggered. I stared at the paper. This was not just a severance check. This was a loaded gun pointed at the head of the company. If I use this, I said, my voice quiet, I am not just leaving. I am taking over. I am stripping Gordon of his majority control. I am forcing an audit that will expose everything. I looked at the fountain. This is war. Renee. If I do this, there is no coming back. I won't just be the daughter who resigned. I will be the daughter who staged a coup. I will destroy his reputation. I will destroy Blair's career. I hesitated. The weight of the decision was crushing. For 34 years, I had been trained to protect the family image. I had been trained to hide the cracks. Even in my resignation, I was just trying to get away, to let them fail on their own terms. But this was active. This was dropping a hammer. I can't do it, I said, closing the folder. It is too much. I have the severance. I can just walk away. I can start over somewhere else. Let them ruin it themselves. Renee reached out and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Juliet, look at me. I looked at her. Her eyes were fierce, the same shade of brown as my mother's. You are not breaking the family, Renee said firmly. The family is already broken. It broke the day Gordon decided that your value was conditional on your obedience. It broke the day he decided Blair's ego was more important than the truth. She tapped the folder. Your mother didn't leave you this so you could destroy them. She left it so you could save the things she actually built. This company supports 500 families. Juliet, if Gordon and Blair drive it into a wall, all those people lose their jobs. The developers you care about, the ones you are worried about right now, they go down with the ship. Renee leaned in closer. You are not doing this out of revenge. You are doing it out of responsibility. You are refusing to be ground down into dust just to keep their illusion alive. That is not hate, Juliet. That is justice. I looked at the folder again. Responsibility. I thought about Miles Carter. I thought about the junior developers who were currently panic coding, trying to meet a deadline that didn't exist. I thought about the client, a healthcare provider that managed patient data. If the system failed because of Blair's lies, real people could be hurt. Gordon didn't care about that. Blair didn't care, but I cared. And my mother had known I would care. She had banked on it. She had hidden this power inside a legal trust because she knew that when the moment came, I would be the only one with the moral compass to use it. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was the fail-safe. I felt a shift inside me. The hesitation didn't disappear, but it solidified into resolve. It was the same feeling I got when I found a critical bug in the code. I didn't want the bug to be there, but now that I had found it, I had to fix it. I picked up my phone. I opened the messaging app and found Imani Brooks, my lawyer. I typed quickly, my thumbs moving with the precision of a pianist. Imani, do not finalize the severance agreement yet. I waited a beat, then typed the next line. I have received a secondary document. It is the deed to the Collins Family Trust. It contains a trigger clause regarding voting rights in the case of material misrepresentation. I attached a photo of the paragraph. The evidence I presented to the board this morning satisfies this condition. The trigger is active. I control the Class A shares. I took a deep breath and typed the final command. Prepare the paperwork to invoke the transfer of voting rights. I am calling for an emergency shareholder vote to appoint an independent auditor. I hit send. I looked at Renee. Okay then, I said. Renee smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was proud. Okay then, she repeated. I stood up. The sun was still hot. The fountain was still cycling, but the world looked different. I wasn't running away anymore. I was turning around to face the fire, and this time, I had the water hose. I picked up the envelope, clutching my mother's legacy to my chest. Let's go, I said. I have work to do. The 48 hours following my departure from the boardroom were not defined by silence. They were defined by a cacophony of digital noise. My father and sister did not take their exposure lying down. They launched a counteroffensive that was as loud as it was desperate. By Wednesday morning, the narrative inside Blackridge had shifted. My phone, which I had kept on silent, was flooded with screenshots forwarded to me by loyalists in the engineering department. Check out the company-wide memo Gordon just sent. One message read, I zoomed in on the image. The email from the CEO's office was a masterpiece of spin, team. As we navigate a critical transition, we are saddened to announce that Juliet Collins has chosen to step down effectively immediately due to personal burnout. While we are disappointed that she chose to abandon the team during the critical phase of Project Willow, we are confident that under Blair's leadership, we will not only meet but exceed our client commitments. I stared at the words, abandon, burnout. They were painting me as the weak link. They were rewriting the story to make it look like I had cracked under pressure. leaving the brave sales team to pick up the pieces. It was a smart move. It protected the stock price temporarily, and it villainized the whistleblower. Blair followed up with her own campaign. According to Miles, she was roaming the development floor like a politician running for office. She was pulling senior developers into glass-walled rooms, offering promises she had no authority to keep. She just offered the QA lead a 20% raise and a title bump to Director of Quality if he signs an affidavit saying the timeline is feasible. Miles texted me. He refused. He told her physics does not care about his job title. I sat in the conference room of Imani Brooks' law office, watching the city skyline through the window. Imani was reviewing the trust documents my aunt had given me. They are trying to buy loyalty, I said, sliding the phone across the table to Imani. Blair is bribing witnesses. Imani looked at the text and adjusted her glasses. It is worse than bribery, she said. It is witness tampering. If we proceed with the independent audit, every one of those offers becomes evidence of a cover-up. I nodded. I had anticipated this. I opened my laptop. I did not abandon them. I said, mostly to myself. I pulled up the email I had sent to Miles and the HR director 2 minutes after I left the building on Tuesday. It was a comprehensive handover packet. It contained the access codes to the repositories, the risk mitigation strategy for the inevitable delay, and a formal recommendation that Miles Carter be named interim technical lead. I had even included a script for how to break the bad news to the client gently. I forwarded this time-stamped proof to Ethan Rowe. Subject re-abandonment narrative. Ethan, please find attached the handover protocols I submitted upon my constructive dismissal. As you can see, I provided a rescue roadmap. If the executive team continues to characterize my departure as abandonment in written communications, I will add defamation to the list of claims. I hit send. Back at the Blackridge headquarters. The ground was shifting beneath my father's feet. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it later from the transcripts. Ethan Rowe had finally found his backbone. Terrified by the email I had sent to the auditors, he had called an emergency meeting with the chief financial officer, Marcus Thorne, and the independent board member, Marianne Holt. Ethan knew that if the ship went down, the general counsel often went down with it. He decided to start turning over rocks before the external investigators arrived. He started with the sales pipeline. Blair had been boasting for months about her record-breaking quarter. She had projected revenue figures that made the board salvage their bonus plans. But projections are not cash. Marcus Thorne, a man who usually just balanced the books without asking questions, was forced to open the actual contracts. What he found was a house of cards. I received a call from Sasha, my headhunter contact, who had heard the rumors rippling through the industry. Juliet, she said. Her voice hushed. Is it true that the Apex deal wasn't signed? I frowned. The Apex deal was Blair's crown jewel. It was a $3 million contract that was supposed to anchor our fiscal year. Blair announced it at the last all-hands meeting. I said, "We pop champagne." Sasha laughed. A dry, cynical sound. Apparently, Marcus pulled the file this morning. There is no signature. There is just a letter of intent and a chain of emails where the client says verbal yes pending a security review. Blair booked it as guaranteed revenue to get her commission early. My stomach turned. Booking a verbal agreement as recognized revenue was not just optimistic, it was accounting fraud. If Blair had used those inflated numbers to secure loans or drive up the internal stock valuation, she had crossed a line that led to federal indictments. It gets worse, Sasha added. Half of her pipeline is ghost revenue. She has been promising features that don't exist to get a handshake, then booking the full value of the deal before the legal review is even done. She built a career on selling vapor. I hung up the phone. I looked at Imani. It is not just Project Willow. I told her, the entire sales strategy is a Ponzi scheme. She sells what we don't have to pay for the problems caused by the last thing she sold that we didn't have. And Gordon, Imani asked. He signs the commission checks. I said, he knows. Or he chooses not to know. At that moment, my email pinged. It was a notification from the Blackridge server. Board meeting agenda. Emergency session. Friday. 9 o'clock. Gordon was trying to get ahead of it. He wanted to close the ranks. I knew exactly what he would do. He would try to force Ethan to limit the scope of the internal review. He would try to frame Blair's fraud as aggressive forecasting and reprimand her privately while burying the evidence. He couldn't afford a full audit because a full audit would show his signature on the approvals. I looked at the trust document on the table, the trust trigger. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Use it only if you have to. I had to. Imani, I said, my voice steady. Execute the trigger. Imani smiled. She had been waiting for this. She pulled a pre-drafted letter from her file. This is a formal notice to the Board of Directors, she explained, reading the text. Citing Article 9 of the Collins Family Trust, we are asserting that the condition of material governance failure has been met due to the concealment of the penalty clauses and the misrepresentation of revenue. She looked up at me. As of the moment this is delivered, Gordon Collins loses the voting rights to the Trust's 40% stake. Those rights revert to you. Send it, I said. Imani pressed the button. The effect was instantaneous. I imagined the notification landing in Ethan Rowe's inbox. I imagined him reading it, his face draining of color, then running down the hall to the boardroom where Gordon was currently trying to bully Marcus into silence. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was not Gordon. It was Blair. I stared at the screen. I had blocked her number, but she was calling from the reception desk line. I debated ignoring it, but I knew this was the end game. I swiped to answer. What did you do? She whispered. She didn't sound angry anymore. She sounded like a child who had broken a vase and realized the glue wouldn't hold. I told the truth. Blair, I said calmly, you stole Dad's votes, she accused, her voice trembling. You stole the company. How could you do this to us? I am your sister. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. That is the problem, Blair. I said, you think being my sister gives you the right to set my life on fire. You think because we share DNA, I am obligated to let you ruin my reputation to save yours. You are just jealous, she snapped, the old defense mechanism kicking in. You have always been jealous that Dad loves me more. You are jealous that I can sell, and you are just a computer nerd. You want to be me. I opened my eyes. I looked at the clean, quiet office around me. I looked at the law degree on Imani's wall. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent coding, fixing, building, while Blair was out drinking martinis and making promises she couldn't keep. I am not jealous. Blair, I said, my voice ice cold. Then what is this? Why are you doing this? I am tired, I said. Silence on the other end. I am tired of being the adult. I continued. I am tired of cleaning up your messes. I am tired of being the villain because I am the only one who does the math. I am not doing this to be you. Blair, I am doing this so I never have to be responsible for you again. I hung up. I turned to Imani. It is done, I said. Imani nodded. She handed me a tablet. The board has responded, she said. I looked at the screen. It was a formal response from Marianne Holt, the independent director. Ms. Collins, we are in receipt of your legal notice regarding the trust. Given the severity of the evidence presented regarding the sales pipeline and the contractual liabilities, the board recognizes the activation of the temporary voting rights transfer. The emergency meeting scheduled for Friday is now a formal shareholder assembly. Agenda Item 1. The removal of Gordon Collins as CEO. Agenda Item 2. The termination of Blair Collins. Agenda Item 3. The appointment of an independent forensic auditor. Your attendance is required to cast the deciding vote. I put the tablet down. Friday morning, it would be the final act. I would have to walk back into that boardroom, not as a suspended employee, not as a daughter, but as the majority shareholder. I would have to look my father in the eye and fire him. I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't happiness. It was the feeling of a fever breaking, leaving the body weak but finally clear of infection. I stood up. I need to buy a suit. I told Imani. She raised an eyebrow. You have suits. Not for this. I said. I need a suit that says, I am not the daughter anymore. I need a suit that says, I am the owner. I walked out of the office. The sun was setting over Charlotte, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. I walked toward the parking lot, my head high, ready for the Friday that would end 100 years of family history and start something new. The dominoes had all fallen. Now, it was time to clear the table. Friday morning arrived with the weight of a judge's gavel. The sky over Charlotte was a bruised purple, heavy with pending rain, matching the atmosphere inside the Black Ridge boardroom. The room was at maximum capacity. Every seat at the mahogany table was filled. The independent directors were present. The external forensic auditors were present. My personal counsel, Imani Brooks, sat to my left. Gordon sat at the head of the table, but he looked like a guest in his own home. He was pale, his tie slightly askew, his eyes darting between the faces of the people he had employed, looking for loyalty he had not earned. Blair sat next to him, silent for once, her hands twisting a paperclip until it snapped. I sat at the opposite end of the table. I was wearing a white suit. It was a deliberate choice. In a room full of gray and black, I wanted to be the light that exposed the dust. The lead auditor, a man named Mr. Henderson with a voice like dry gravel, stood up. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened a thick binder and began to read the preliminary findings. We have reviewed the sales logs, the client correspondence, and the internal technical assessments for the last 4 quarters. Henderson stated, "The findings are conclusive. There is a systemic pattern of material misrepresentation within the sales division." He clicked a remote, and a chart appeared on the screen. 80% of the current sales pipeline is classified as high risk. He continued, "We found 12 separate instances where the Vice President of Sales, Ms. Blair Collins, promised features that do not exist in the current codebase. In 4 of those instances, revenue was recognized based on verbal agreements that were never formalized with a signature. This has artificially inflated the company valuation by nearly 18%. The board members shifted in their seats. 18% was not an accounting error, it was fraud." Henderson turned the page. Furthermore, regarding the Project Willow contract, we found that the CEO, Mr. Gordon Collins, bypassed the mandatory technical review process. He authorized a penalty clause that, based on the engineering logs provided by Ms. Juliet Collins, guarantees a financial loss of approximately $200,000 per week, starting in late November. Ethan Rowe spoke up. His voice was shaky but determined. "The legal exposure here is catastrophic," Ethan said. "If we do not disclose this to the shareholders immediately, every person in this room could face criminal negligence charges. We cannot hide this. Transparency is the only way we survive the lawsuits that are coming." Blair slammed her hand on the table. The paperclip flew across the wood. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. Her voice cracked. "I was doing my job. I was selling the vision. You are blaming me because the engineering team is too lazy to build what I sell. If Juliet had just pushed her team harder, none of this would be a problem." Marianne Holt cut her off. She did not raise her voice. She simply held up a single sheet of paper. "We have the logs." "Blair," Marianne said coldly, "we have the emails. Juliet warned you in September. She warned you in October. She warned you 3 days ago. The data shows that the engineering team has been working 80-hour weeks while you were booking revenue that didn't exist. This is not a technical failure. This is a failure of integrity." Gordon stood up. He tried to summon the old thunder, the commanding presence that had ruled this room for 30 years. "Enough," Gordon roared. "I will not have my daughter interrogated like a criminal in front of strangers. This meeting is over. I am ordering a recess. Everyone out." He looked around the room, expecting compliance. He expected them to scurry away like they always did. Nobody moved. Mr. Henderson did not look up from his binder. Ethan Rowe looked at the table. Marianne Holt looked at me. "You cannot adjourn this meeting." "Gordon," I said. My voice was calm, cutting through the tension like a razor. "I am the CEO," Gordon shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "I control the majority vote. I say we are done, no." I corrected him. "You don't." I slid the document Imani had prepared across the table. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, The trust trigger has been activated. I stated, under Article 9 of the Collins Family Trust, your voting rights for the 40% stake held by my mother's estate have been suspended due to material governance failure. Gordon stared at me. He looked like a man who had been shot and hadn't realized he was bleeding yet. Those votes have transferred to me. I said. I looked at Marianne. We have a quorum, I said, and we have a motion on the table. Marianne nodded. She looked at her notes. The motion is to remove Gordon Collins as CEO effective immediately, pending a full investigation, and to appoint an interim CEO from outside the family. The motion also calls for the immediate removal of Blair Collins from all client-facing roles, and a suspension of her employment pending the audit results. Gordon slumped back into his chair. He looked at Blair. She was crying now, silent, ugly tears that smeared her mascara. She realized that her father could not save her because he could not even save himself. I call for the vote, Marianne said. All in favor, Marianne raised her hand. The other independent directors raised their hands. I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had taught me to ride a bike, and the man who had taught me that my worth was transactional. I looked at the man who had suspended me because I refused to lie for his golden child. I raised my hand. The motion passes. Marianne declared. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing. Gordon Collins was no longer the CEO of Blackridge. Security, Marianne said into the intercom. Please escort Mr. Collins and Ms. Collins to HR to process their badge surrender. Wait, I said. The room froze. Gordon looked at me. A flicker of hope in his eyes. He thought I might waver. He thought I might show mercy. I am not changing the vote. I said, but I have conditions before I sign my own exit papers. I looked at the interim leadership team. Project Willow cannot be delivered in 4 weeks. I said, if you try to force it, you will destroy the team and the client's data. My condition is that you empower Miles Carter to speak directly to the client today. He needs to tell them the truth about the timeline. He needs full autonomy to negotiate a realistic delivery date of January 15th. I looked at Blair. And he does it without sales interference, I added. Ethan Rowe nodded vigorously. Agreed. We will draft the communication strategy immediately. We will frame it as a quality assurance delay. It is better to be late than to be sued. Thank you, I said. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the severance agreement Ethan had drafted 2 days ago. It was a generous package. It included the 12 months of salary, the accelerated stock vesting, and a full release of claims. I took a silver pen from my pocket. I signed the document with a steady hand. I pushed the paper toward the center of the table. I am officially resigned, I announced. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my white suit. I picked up my purse. I walked toward the door. Passing the chair where Blair was sobbing into her hands, I stopped next to Gordon. He was staring at the table, his hands shaking. He looked up at me as I passed. His eyes were red, filled with a mixture of confusion and heartbreak. You did this to hurt me, he whispered. His voice was hoarse. You suspended me because you wanted to hurt me. You wanted revenge. I looked down at him. I felt a profound sense of sadness, but no regret. No. Dad, I said softly. You suspended me because you wanted me to apologize for being right. You wanted me to beg for your respect. I paused, letting the words settle in the space between us. When I said, okay then, I wasn't agreeing to your punishment. I explained. I was agreeing to the reality that you would never respect me unless I forced you to. I stopped asking for permission to be heard. Gordon swallowed hard. Is this revenge? He asked again. Is that what your mother wanted? I shook my head. No. I said, this isn't revenge. This is just an ending. I turned away from him. I walked out of the boardroom. The heavy doors closed behind me with a final, satisfying click. I walked onto the engineering floor. The news had not officially broken yet, but the energy in the room had shifted. The developers saw me walking from the executive suite. They saw the white suit. They saw that I was alone, and that I was walking with my head high. Miles Carter stood up from his desk. He looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He understood. He was in charge now. The team was safe. The product would be built correctly, or not at all. I walked down the main aisle. No one spoke. But as I passed, I heard the subtle sounds of work stopping. I felt their eyes on me. It wasn't the fearful gaze of Tuesday morning. It was a silent salute. I pushed through the glass doors of the main lobby. I handed my badge to the receptionist, who looked at it as if it were a holy relic. "Have a good life, Juliet," she whispered. I walked out into the parking lot. The rain had started to fall. A light, cleansing mist that cooled the air. I didn't run to my car. I walked slowly. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that didn't smell of recycled fear and stale coffee. I was unemployed. I was estranged from my family. I was alone, and for the first time in 34 years, I was free. Thank you so much for listening to Juliet's story of corporate justice and family liberation. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, so we can see how far this story has traveled. Please consider subscribing to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, liking this video, and hitting that hype button to help us share more powerful stories like this one with the world. Your support means everything.